Enemy peeps, here we go for the digestive system. So when we talk digestive system or the GI tract or the alimentary canal, basically its primary purpose is to acquire nutrients from the environment. So we need to consume them. We are going to then take those nutrients and we are going to synthesize or make, that's called anabolism, essential compounds. So stuff that we need in our body to be able to build cells and tissues and organs, etc. And then we also, obviously, to make these essential compounds, in some cases, we have to break it down, which is catabolism. We have to break down these foods and nutrients that we consume in order to be able to do that. So in our GI tract, our gastrointestinal tract, and as I mentioned before, sometimes referred to as the alimentary canal, it's basically one long tube, and it just has modifications in different areas. So from mouth to anus, that is one long tube, all right? So that is your esophagus that turns into your stomach, that turns into your small intestine, that turns into your large intestine, that turns into your rectum. And the opening on either end, mouth and anus or rectum, are the two entry or openings, one to enter and one to exit. You also have accessory organs that assist in this process. So obviously parts in your oral cavity, such as your teeth, your salivary glands, your tongue. You also have other glandular organs like your pancreas or your gallbladder or your liver that contribute to either compounds, enzymes, digestive juice, etc., to make this process happen. All right. And so here is our GI tract, again, starting from the oral cavity or the mouth, extending through this long tube that just has modifications. So we have this skinny esophagus, it's very malleable, into our stomach that has been modified into several muscular layers along with other things. That's going to then be transformed into the small intestine, which is this stuff in here. Three main sections to that, and lots of important stuff happens in the small intestine. And that will eventually merge and convert into the large intestine. There's your appendix down there, FYI. But your large intestine or your colon that has these four segments, including a cecum. So that's the fifth, that go up, across, down, and around into the rectum, and then obviously ending at the anus. Right. Here are some of those accessory organs that I mentioned. Obviously, your teeth, your salivary glands, and your tongue in your mouth. Your liver, this very large lobular organ, your gallbladder tucked away in there, your pancreas, which has not only a digestive function, but also an endocrine function as well. Think diabetes. Those are all accessory organs that we will discuss or take a look at. So when we talk digestion, we are looking at the processes, and here they are listed, and we'll talk about them separately. So one of your first processes for digestion is ingestion, right? We have to consume the nutrients. Then we begin mechanical digestion. So we start physically breaking them down, and then propulsion. So we move them from point A, our oral cavity, through our esophagus into our stomach, and so on. Then we have chemical digestion, some of which starts in the oral cavity, most of which happens in the stomach and the small intestine. We have secretion that occurs, salivary glands, pancreas, gallbladder, liver. We secrete small intestine. We secrete various enzymes and juices and acids to contribute to the digestive process. Absorption, which primarily takes place in the small intestine, which is where we get those nutrients and we suck them up into our tissues in our blood, and then we send them to the various organs that need them to produce new cell tissue or cells. And then defecation, all right? I said poop, right? We got to talk about poop when we talk about digestion as well. We have to get rid of the waste and then the undigestible products that we have, all right? And so here is a little bit more of that breakdown of those different areas, and you can look at some more detail. I would make sure that I know where, so which organs, which section of the GI tract, these various actions or functions are taking place. And we'll walk through this with a pear deck or two as well. Notice in absorption, it is more than just like food particles, right? Obviously, all organic molecules are electrolytes, so ions, sodium, chlorine, potassium, etc. Vitamins, hugely important, all right? We don't really make too many vitamins ourselves, so we have to consume them. And usually the amounts we need are pretty small. So if you eat a well-balanced diet, you really don't need to take a supplement of a vitamin, at least a multi one. Usually it's particular vitamins that you are lacking in, so it's something to think about. Our body typically doesn't store vitamins in large amounts, so we consume it, we use it, and we usually only keep a small amount. So taking extra doesn't really do anything for you, just kind of waste your money. Minerals, and then obviously water. All right. All right, in terms of how do we do this, our digestive tract or our GI tract has to have a very particular lining for a variety of reasons. All right, one, it needs to be able to withstand the amount of digestive juices, which contain acids, and the types of enzymes that we use to be able to break down nutrients. Obviously, we don't want to secrete these things and then eat away at the lining in our GI tract. That would kind of defeat the purpose. So it has to be able to withstand that. It has to be able to withstand the mechanical stresses of all of these nutrients being propelled down and through it in order to be able to function properly, all right? And then obviously we have gut or microbes or bacteria that lives within our GI tract, typically within our large intestine. And that helps us, and our stomach, and that helps us to be able to break down some foods that we couldn't. And they usually don't cause a problem unless we kind of trigger them to, all right? Or something we ingested triggers them to as well. Right? So our lining that is located primarily in the abdominal cavity is called the peritoneum. So this is right along the lines with pericardium and pleural membranes. And so another serous membrane, so a double layer, right? It's going to have a visceral layer, a serosa. All right, so that's our visceral peritoneum, and that's going to cover all of the organs in our peritoneal cavity. And then you have a parietal peritoneum, and that's basically going to line the abdominal cavity wall. You're also going to have a fluid there, again, much like we had in the pericardium, right? We had the pericardial fluid, and then in the pleural cavity with our lungs, we also had that. Again, key function here, bullet number 2, allows for that sliding, reducing friction, reducing irritation. Because again, this is something that's going to be squeezing and moving food down, and so we don't want to have any abrasions happening. You also have another membrane called a mesentery, and we have several of these that are located within the peritoneal cavity. And basically, these mesenteries connect the two parts of the peritoneum, the parietal and the visceral. They also provide kind of a network webbing for blood vessels, for lymphatic vessels, and for nerves to be able to kind of make their way. When we dissect our minks, we'll cut into the abdominal cavity and we'll move those muscles away, and you'll see the mesentery kind of sits on top. It also kind of holds everything together and contributes to that stabilizing of our abdominal organs. All right. We'll usually have a lot of adipose tissue located in these mesenteries, and two particular ones called the greater and lesser omentum. And that basically provides padding and protection for these organs in our abdomen. It also is kind of the flip side where, like, if we have a little bit too much adipose in our diet and we don't do the exercise, you end up with a lot of adipose tissue stored there. All right. So you can end up with those bellies. And alcohol in particular results in that storage of those lipids in that area. And that's where we get the term a beer belly from. Right. So again, details of the mesenteries, again, providing stability, allows for some slight movements within, and just stabilizes the majority of your intestines in particular and your large intestine. So your mesentery proper kind of focuses on the small intestine. Your mesocolon focuses on the large intestine. And again, when we dissect those minks, we're going to pull out the intestines and you'll be able to see the mesentery that kind of connects them together. Again, kind of like a spider webbing to maintain those organs, because they're like sausage links to maintain them in place. And here we go. We can take a look here. These would be mesenteries that are located around here and here. And then again, you can see another mesentery up here. Or at least part of those, the greater and lesser omentums that have been cut. But again, you can see them as attachment points, kind of spider webbing that, anchors your various digestive organs there, okay? In addition to the cavity itself having a membrane, your GI tract itself has layers. So this is not just a singular tube with one set of wallpaper. It's got multiple layers here, and here they are listed. You have a mucosal layer. You have a submucosal, so sub meaning below. You have muscular layer or layers, depending on which portion of the GI tract we're in. And then you have the serosa. All right, so you have that peritoneum. It's going to vary by region. So you're going to have different types of structural characteristics for these layers in different portions of the GI tract. And that's going to lead to difference in functions, right? Because not all parts of the GI tract do the same functions, which is why they are shaped different and why we see them having different designs there. So here's just a very generic piece of what we would see in a GI tract. So you have your mucosa layer is the most superficial. In other words, it's the layer that is the first layer after the lumen being the open space in which food and nutrients flow through. So you start with the mucosa layer. Deep to that is the submucosa, so below the mucosa layer. Then you have a muscular layer or layers, depending again on which portion of the GI tract we're in. And then the deepest, so to speak, layer is going to be the serosa, and that's going to be that lining, that visceral peritoneum that's going to then anchor to the mesentery and to the abdominal cavity. Right? So you can see a couple of structural key pieces. I like the zoom in piece because it just gives you an idea of thickness for these different areas. It gives you an idea that we're going to have these foldings within. We'll talk more about those in a minute. Because that's going to lead to some increases in surface area, both for digestive release or digestive juice release, as well as for absorption. All right, so we'll see some variation in that. All right, so your mucosa is that inner lining, right? It sits right abutted to the lumen, the opening, and it's going to have various types of tissue there. Following that, you're going to have some aeration. So you're going to have the tissue that's going to contain all of your connections to blood vessels, nerves, lymph, smooth muscle, etc. Then you're going to have your muscularis layers, all right? And so those are going to be a little bit deeper. Not only are you going to have muscular tissue, and this is smooth muscle, you're also going to have elastic fibers because obviously we're going to be able to expand and contract that area to be able to move various types and amounts of nutrients through, all right? You're going to have a couple of different layers of your muscular tissue. And again, depending on which portion of the GI tract you're in, this may increase or decrease, but usually or typically you'll have two. You'll have a circular muscle layer and a longitudinal muscle layer. And that just means in terms of how the fibers are organized. Think back to our skeletal muscle unit in January, right? We talked about all those different fascicle arrangements, parallel versus circular versus why can't I think of any more of them right now off the top of my head? Convergent, etc. Okay, or pennate. There we go. Now they all start coming there when I'm done talking about it. Then we've got our submucosa layer here. You're going to have some denser tissue, and again, you're going to have vascularization here. You're also going to have some exocrine glands, and this is so we can release enzymes and acids and other juices, products that we might need for the digestive purposes. All right, and our muscular, as we already talked about, the inner circular layer and that outer longitudinal layer, again, providing not only mechanical digestion, but also the peristalsis or the propulsion, the movement of our nutrients from one point to another. Okay, and then lastly, our serosa, which again is that peritoneal connection, connecting to the mesentery, connecting to the abdominal cavity as well. So in terms of how we move this, we're going to have smooth muscle contraction. Smooth muscle contraction, what happens is going to be peristalsis, which is the propulsion process. And basically it's kind of wavular. And I think I've got our images here. So let's walk through that. So we have our two layers of muscle here in our, let's say our esophagus, mouth end. So here, anus end here, here's our generic food. Right, and so it's there, and what you're going to start to see is kind of a wave contraction that's going to basically kind of squeeze down the GI tract, and it's going to propel this, all right, food forward as we squeeze, kind of like when you're using your tube of toothpaste properly, starting from the bottom and going up and squeezing, pushing all that toothpaste out the end. That's basically how your GI tract works to propel ingested food all the way through into your stomach and then your further intestines and so on. All right. That process is sometimes referred to as well as called segmentation. And basically what that means is that you're going to have these cycles of contraction, cycles of waves that allow not only for that propulsion or peristalsis movement, but also churning in our stomachs, as well as within our small intestine, so that we can mix up the juices that we want to digest the food, break it down, and then those particles can interact, perform their chemical reactions to break those larger compounds down, and then be left with the nutrients that we need in order to absorb them. Okay. All right, for the remainder of this lecture, we're going to take a quick look at a couple of our digestive organisms here, starting at the oral cavity. And you can see the list of functions that we have. All right, obviously, we're going to have some sensory information here. So we are going to be able to identify foods right through taste using chemical receptors. Mechanical digestion is going to begin in the mouth using our teeth, right? We're going to physically break up particles. You are going to lubricate this food. We eventually call a bolus when we start swallowing it by adding in not only saliva, but also mucus. And that's going to contain various enzymes to be able to break down that food. And that begins that chemical digestion. So very little chemical digestion takes place in the mouth, but it does begin there through some of those enzymes in our saliva. All right, so we're in the oral cavity. That also includes the oropharynx, which is the part of our throat that's behind our mouth. And there is a structure that you can always see in there, and that's called the uvula. That's that little dangling thing in the back of your throat. And basically, it kind of acts as like a little doorway to prevent food from kind of jumping into the oropharynx before you've chewed up enough. Doesn't always work perfectly because it is only that small piece, but it does prevent large objects, large undigested pieces of food from making its way back into the pharynx. You'll do your labeling. Obviously, we are not going into the level of detail that you need to label on here. So very briefly, your tongue, your oropharynx, your uvula, your esophagus, or your laryngopharynx, would be the things to identify as well. Not too much of the other structures will we be focusing on. Your tongue is going to contribute to all of those functions almost that we talked about. Its main job is to kind of provide manipulation and movement to that mechanical digestion, as well as sensory reception. So we can kind of have an idea of what it is that we are eating. The chemical piece of digestion is going to come from your salivary glands, and you have three sets of them: the parotid, your sublingual, and your submandibular. And basically, they're going to produce saliva, and each saliva that comes from each of those glands is going to have slightly different amylase. All right, so here is our first enzyme, salivary amylase, and that is going to be the enzyme that we'll hear the most about. And typically, it's going to be involved in the breakdown of carbohydrates or starches. And so that's what's going to be released typically in those salivary glands. All right, you're also going to have mucus produced because that adds to the digestive process. And then you're also going to have, some white blood cells, some other chemical buffers to be able to create that bolus and begin that mechanical and chemical digestion portion as well. You can get a quick look at where those glands are at. So here's your parotid gland here. Your sublingual is below your tongue. And then below that is your submandibular on an angle there. So you can see where those three are located. That would all those are your only three that you need to be aware of on this diagram. Okay, get an idea of what a duct looks like in one of your salivary glands. So you've got your columnar cells here. You have your mucus producing cells, and then they're going to push that out into this duct, and that's going to then go and be released into your mouth. Okay. Just some interesting facts about saliva, should you be interested. Bottom line is saliva is primarily water, and then you can see very small percentage of that remains are all those other things that we've talked about. Some white blood cells, some antibodies, some enzymes, like your salivary amylase, your glycoproteins, electrolytes in your mucus, etc. Additionally, besides the initiation of that chemical digestion, you can see other functions. And one of the important ones is that it does control the amount of bacteria that's in your mouth and what your bacteria can produce. All right, saliva helps to keep the pH of your mouth right around the pH of water, right, 7, right in the middle. And that helps to keep that oral cavity as healthy as possible. So a nice additional function that we typically don't think about. In terms of what happens in your mouth through the use of your teeth and your tongue and your salivary glands, that process of chewing your food is referred to as mastication. And basically, you are using your jaw muscles, your tongue to be able to physically rip apart your food and then use your tongue to kind of roll that food together into what's referred to as a bolus. And so when you swallow what you're swallowing, we now refer to as a bolus. Much easier than the individual pieces of the food that you are eating. That bolus makes its way back into our pharynx, which we've already talked about, and we will be sending that down your oropharynx. But remember, if you try and talk or laugh while you're eating, remember that because the pharynx is connected oro, naso, and laryngeal, that things that you're swallowing or drinking can go up into your nasal passage and shoot out, or down into your laryngopharynx and potentially go down the wrong pipe. So it's definitely very important that you are not talking with your mouth full to avoid that from happening. All right. Last but not least here, for at least our first lecture, is the esophagus. The esophagus is basically a muscular tube extending from behind or is located posterior to the trachea. It is going to make its way from the laryngopharynx all the way down to what's referred to as the esophageal hiatus. And that is going to then be sneaking through that spot to connect with our stomachs. And that is how we get our food from our mouth to our stomach. It has muscular layers that perform peristalsis to allow for that propulsion of our food to make its way down. You can see what type of layers the esophagus has. We have a mucosa, a submucosa, and a muscular layer. And here we can see, all right, our mucosal layer, we can see our submucosal layer, and we can see our muscular layer here around. And then this space in here is our lumen, and that is something that can open and close, so we can squeeze it just like that tube of toothpaste all the way down into our stomachs. All right. So the swallowing process, which is what begins our journey down into our esophagus and our GI tract, is initiated from our brain. We won't get into details of that, but it has essentially 3 phases to be able to do that. You have a buccal, a pharyngeal, and an esophageal phase. Your buccal phase is going to essentially be forming that bolus and kind of pushing it around into your mouth and getting it towards the back of your oral cavity, to your oropharynx. The pharyngeal phase is going to be when we start to move that bolus down your oral cavity into the laryngopharynx. And obviously our epiglottis is going to cover up our larynx so that we only take that food down into our esophagus. And then we're in the esophagus. And so that's going to be that peristalsis, that squeezing of the tube of toothpaste all the way down in that wave form until that bolus enters into the stomach. And that is where we'll pick up next time.